Hello, Canucks fans, and welcome back to another episode of Canucks Conversation, an emergency episode of Canucks Conversation. It is brought to you by Greta, the home of our electric watch parties during the season and our off-season chill spot at this time of year. Make Greta your spot to eat, drink, and play this summer. David Quadrelli alongside Jeff Patterson. It's an emergency edition of Canucks Conversation because, as you see at the bottom there, breaking news: the Vancouver Canucks have traded Ilya Mikheyev to the Chicago Blackhawks. We're going to break down the full deal. We're going to get into the players going both, well, I shouldn't say going both ways, going to Chicago and how it all went for them in Vancouver. But first, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me on short notice tonight. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm filling in for Harm, so you can see I've got the facial hair, or at least given it a try at the very least. It's funny when I see the banner across the bottom, breaking, and yeah, sure. I mean, the Canucks made a move here, and I'm happy to join you and talk about it. Botch and I used to have this debate about what constitutes an emergency podcast, what meets the quota for an emergency podcast. I didn't, in my wildest dreams, think that anything involving Ilya Mikheyev would, but hey, they signed Teddy Bluger as well, so a little bit of meaty Canucks news late in the day, so let's get after it.
Here's my thought process. If this trade happens in November, no emergency episode. But the fact that it happens 4 days before free agency, that's why we're having this conversation. Obviously, that's going to be a big part of the conversation that we do have. Someone asked us to have an emergency episode for Mark Friedman signing last week. And no disrespect to Mark Friedman.
That's a hard
That's where I draw the line. I draw the line right at Mark Friedman. Unfortunately, he's on the wrong side of that line. Okay, Jeff, let's break down this trade. If you could pull up the whole package here, Grady. The Canucks put this out themselves. Frank Saravalli, our guy over at Daily Faceoff, also had the return. Sorry, let me just pull it up here. Yeah, so to the Blackhawks, Ilya Mikheyev, a 2027 second-round pick, pending UFA Sam Lafferty, and to the Canucks, a 2027 fourth-round pick. The Canucks are retaining 15% on Mikheyev's contract.
You want my response?
Want your response. Of course.
I thought you were going to weigh in. Look, I applaud Patrick Allvin. The guy's aggressive. He and Jim Rutherford make things happen. We've seen this for more than a dozen months now. When trades haven't really been happening around the National Hockey League, you want trades? Come to the Vancouver Canucks. They find a way to make things happen. And so to get the bulk of Ilya Mikheyev's deal, and it isn't just this year, 2 years left on this trade or on this contract, is it a perfect deal for the Vancouver Canucks, giving up a second rounder and 15% retention? No. Am I going to lose sleep over the 15% retention? Nope. And really, when you look at the Canucks get a fourth rounder, and I love the Canucks press release that they put out, Canucks acquire a fourth round. It's like, yeah, I mean, they did. That doesn't tell much of the story about the deal, but yes, the Canucks acquired a fourth rounder, and all of these are in 2027 as well. So they're kicking this can way down the road. Essentially, they get, they move back 2 rounds in that 2027 draft to get off Ilya Mikheyev. I think all things considered, now we have to see the other shoe. Like, what are the Canucks up to? We were asking that question about Steve Yzerman when he paid a second rounder to move Jake Wallman to San Jose yesterday. And I know Frank thought that was going to be an outlier price. And really, when you look at the Canucks being able to get out from $4 million plus of Ilya Mikheyev, to do it at the cost of a second rounder, but getting a fourth rounder, essentially dropping back 2 rounds, all things considered, if it sets the Vancouver Canucks to either retain a couple other big names or go big game hunting when the free agent window opens on Monday, then I think this is a good move for the Vancouver Canucks, positioning themselves for whatever's to come next year.
So with the 15% retained, it equates to about $700,000 that the Canucks are going to retain on this deal for both years. That leaves them with $4.035 million in savings heading into this offseason and heading into free agency. So Jeff, the way I look at this trade, first of all, when it comes to trading draft picks, I said this on today's episode of Canucks Conversation, is that when you're a competitive team, you're not looking at your draft capital as saying, okay, we need to use this pick to draft this player or for this. You're using that draft capital to make your team better. And it can be from drafting players. Like back when the Canucks weren't great, it should be. You have to try and draft your players. That's how you're going to get out of this. Now that they're a good team and now that they're competitive, like this is what good teams do. They trade their draft picks. So the way I looked at it when I was talking about it with Harmon is, okay, let's say you keep that second round pick. You're probably going into the season, and at some point, you're going to want to move that pick to make your team better in season. You think of the Elias Lindholm trade where they moved to first. You think of the Nikita Zadorov trade where they moved to third and a fifth. One way or another, you're probably going to move some draft picks to make your team better. So if the Canucks felt, and clearly they did, that moving that second round pick now would give them the cap savings to make their team better right now, and they didn't want to wait for in season, clearly there's something up here. Clearly they feel like they can do something big in free agency and that they're going to use those cap savings. So a lot of people in the chat wondering if that means Dakota Joshua, wondering if it means Nikita Zadorov. Obviously, Jake Gensel is the big fish that we know the Canucks are very, very high on and they've been linked to before. I look at this trade and I say, I liked the trade, the first one that came out, liked it a little bit less with the 15% retained, but you're not losing sleep over it. I don't love it, but I think ultimately you reserve judgment until you see what they do with these cap savings.
Well, I think it's important, Dave, too, to remember that Dan Milstein is in the middle of all of this. His fingerprints are all over this. The Canucks gave him permission to try to broker a deal that they had been trying to make themselves since before the All-Star break, and it just hadn't happened. Now, it took some creativity, and ultimately it took the Canucks bending a little bit on both the sweetener and the retention. But, Mikheyev's a Milstein client, and so is Nikita Zadorov. And you just wonder, the fact that Nikita Zadorov and Milstein publicly is, recently as today, saying he's willing to sit and be patient to see, that felt like a signal that, everything that you see and read, and just reading between the lines, Zadorov wants to be here. And I do wonder if this move, that's $4 million that they didn't have to play with earlier today. Is that enough to get the Zadorov deal done and still do some of the things that you just mentioned there? But it really feels to me like, with Milstein in the middle of this, and I know people used to joke he was the assistant GM of the Vancouver Canucks. And look, it's not easy. Like, the Canucks gave Brock Besser's agent license to try and broker a deal. That didn't happen. Connor Garland, his agent, was out there. So credit to Dan Milstein. He had a client that he's trying to do right by. Ilya Mikheyev's an interesting guy to me. I do think he's a really perfect candidate for a bounce back season. I think there's a better player there than we saw down the stretch, but it's impossible to ignore one goal in his final 61 games and all of those chances. And maybe that's why I say there's more there. He got chances. He just had no finish. The hands, I know the story at the start of the season was his knee, but really the story at the end of the season was his hands. And you just think to the opportunities that he had, even in the playoffs, it can't remain that cold for this guy. And I would think he'll get an opportunity to play a fair bit in Chicago. If he has a full summer to train, the knee, look at Oliver Ekman-Larsson, had a full season to train last year and is hoisting the Stanley Cup with the Florida Panthers. I'm not saying that Mikheyev's going to hoist the cup next year. Don't get me wrong when I say that, but I'm just saying, for a guy that had serious knee surgery, he really didn't have last summer and offseason to train the way he would like to. I think if he recognizes that he's got to be better, has this season to dedicate and devote to preparing for next season, I think he's 29. I think he can play reasonably well and kill penalties for the Chicago Blackhawks. He's a good defensive player, but he and Patrick Allvin said as much on that media exit day. It was on him. Mikheyev never should have had a sniff in the top six on a well-constructed hockey club, but the Canucks had some issues, and now they're trying to rectify that, and this is a big step forward for the hockey club, clearing the decks of $4 million.
I saw someone on Twitter saying, get ready for Ilya Mikheyev to pot 30 playing with Connor Bedard next year. So maybe not a cup, but a bounce back for sure. And maybe not 30 goals, but you do think there's going to be a bounce back. Let's make no mistake about it. Ilya Mikheyev's a player who thrived on his north-south speed, Jeff. He should have been a dream under Rick Tocchet, and he was fine in his first season playing on that partially torn ACL. It was after he came back, and obviously the surgery, the timeline was a little bit longer than I think he or the club expected originally. He wasn't ready for the start of the year. We were told, it looks like he's going to be ready for training camp. Didn't happen, wasn't ready for the start of the season. And then when he eventually got here, it just, he couldn't find his feet. He couldn't get his feet under him. And that first season in Vancouver, Jeff, people might forget that he was not that bad. It was 13 goals, 15 assists through 46 games compared to 11 goals and 20 assists through 78 this past season. And like you said, obviously that long stretch without a goal. But I agree with you. He's a prime candidate to bounce back. I just think for the Canucks, they couldn't take that risk. That's ultimately what this came down to, right? They might think he might bounce back, and Chicago certainly can take that risk. So they get an asset, they assume that risk. But for the Canucks, they're trying to make this team better, and the cap space is going to help them make that team better. And B, they really, really couldn't take that risk, I don't think, of going into next year, especially if this is all it costs to move him out.
Right. And I just think that, if they weren't able to get done what they want to get done here in July 1st, 2nd, whatever, in this first week of free agency, if they come back to training camp and Mikheyev's on that roster, I just fear that at some point, as an option, they would try to, hey, let's give it another shot and see. Like I wanted no part of him in the top 6 for the Vancouver Canucks, and he was just too expensive to be a bottom 6 guy on this hockey club. The Blackhawks can take on that risk. They can put him wherever they want. If he gets a chance to play with Bedard, great landing spot for him. I don't think that's probably the best place for him and for the Chicago Blackhawks, but let's see where it goes. He's now a Hawk. He's no longer a Canuck. And so now it's a question of what does Vancouver do with these cap savings they've got. But what a wild pattern, too. It used to be the Canucks in Florida linked up on just about every trade that Vancouver was involved in. Not that long ago, it was Jason Dickinson to the Blackhawks. That's why the Canucks don't have a second rounder in this year's draft. Anthony Beauvillier found his way to Chicago briefly before moving on to Nashville. And now it's Ilya Mikheyev. And so the Blackhawks becoming a bit of a dumping ground and being paid to take on some of these bad contracts on the part of the Vancouver Canucks.
Okay, let's get to the YouTube live chat. We've got a lot of people. We've got people on Twitter. I saw one there from, I think, Spencer Dawson on Twitter. And this one was one that I thought about for a few seconds. And I'll just give you my initial reaction. He was saying, am I crazy to say that last year's team plus Jake Gensel isn't a cup contender, isn't a Stanley Cup winner or whatever it was? Yeah, it's still not a cup winner. It's hard to win Stanley Cup, first of all. But what I will say is, like, this team got to Game 7 in round 2 without Thatcher Demko. And Thatcher Demko is arguably their biggest X factor in any playoff series against any playoff team. So I don't think you're crazy for saying it, because I am not coming out here to proclaim the Canucks a cup winner before they've even signed Jake Gensel. We should also mention, but I don't know if you're giving them enough credit for what they did with the goaltending that they had in the playoffs. And Shelov's was good, but obviously it's not Demko.
Yeah, and I maintain that if they had a healthy Demko at the top of his game, could he have won one more game against the Edmonton Oilers? Yeah, probably somewhere along the line. But, coulda, shoulda, woulda. And part of Thatcher Demko's story is his availability. And that's an issue moving forward as well. But, I look at the Florida Panthers. They are the Stanley Cup champs. And I think there's a lot of focus on what the Canucks did or didn't do against Edmonton and one win away. And could they have beaten the Oilers and what would happen against Dallas? Ultimately, it was Florida, and it took them 7 games and a weird route to get to a win in Game 7. But they got there. And what's fascinating to me, Dave, is you look at the Florida Panthers, like so much focus, and rightly so, on McDavid in these playoffs. 42 points, 25 games, 10 points better than any other player that took part in the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Florida Panthers just won the Stanley Cup. They didn't have a point per game guy in the playoffs. Barkov and Tkachuk led the team with 22 points in 24 games. So you don't need guys to absolutely go off and do historic things. What you need is your best players to show up, be invested, to dig in, and produce on a nightly basis and not have any long stretches. And so we talk about Demko, obviously. Elias Pettersson didn't have the kind of playoffs that he wanted. I still think Quinn Hughes has room to level up in the playoffs as well. We'll see what the learning is for the Vancouver Canucks coming out of the 13 games that ultimately they did play. But, the Florida Panthers didn't overwhelm with superstardom. It's just that their stars were there. Verhaeghe had 11 goals. Reinhart ends up with 10, including the cup winner. And so to me, it's a consistency thing. It's being there every night. The Panthers had pretty good luck on the injury front. Guys were available for the most part. I'm sure players were playing through some things, but so are the Vancouver Canucks, as they were constructed, legitimate Stanley Cup contenders? No, they had trouble scoring goals. We saw that. There are still some questions around the, at the fringes of their lineup. But ultimately, I think if their best players were all at the top of their game, that there probably was more hockey for the Vancouver Canucks this spring. Ultimately, their top players, or a few of them, were either injured or didn't perform the way that the Vancouver Canucks needed them. And you hope that, some guys do a little bit of soul searching in the offseason and recognize that, 13 games was fun, but it was hard. But 25 games at that time of year, obviously going to be that much more difficult for the Vancouver Canucks. So I think there's obviously a really nice core in place. And now this door opens on Monday to add to this core, to continue to surround this core, and to try to fill out at the fringes and make this team even better. It's not going to be easy. And Patrick Relvin knows that. But they've got opportunities here because they've got some money to play with.
They've got some money to play with. Chance to go to Nikita Zadorov. We've got a lot of people watching right now across multiple platforms. So my name is Dave Guidrelli. I host Canucks Conversation 5 days a week over on the Canucks Army YouTube channel, which is where you might be watching this. Make sure you hit like on the video and hit subscribe as well. And I'm joined by Jeff Patterson, who's holding perfectly fitting that rink-wide Vancouver mic during the season. Rink-wide is a post-game show, weekly episodes during the off season. So make sure you go subscribe to Rink-Wide Vancouver as well on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast. Jeff, I want to ask you this question because everybody's throwing out there, this is what they should do with the money. This is what they should do with the money. What should they do with the money? And I'm not going to ask you to fill out the bottom six and go fill out the bottom pairing and all that sort of stuff. But like your big moves, I'll go first. I lean more toward Nikita Zadorov than Dakota Joshua. And I think the chat feels the same way based on what I've seen. I lean more to signing Nikita Zadorov than I do Dakota Joshua. And of course, I want the Canucks to go out and get Jake Gensel. But those would be the two that I would say I would like to go see them sign.
Well, and again, I think there's every reason to think that this Mikheyev move is linked to Zadorov, just with Milstein in the middle of things. But also, as much as Patrick Levine and Jim Rutherford are the architects, they're in charge of building this team. Rick Tocchet is the coach of the year in the National Hockey League. He gets some say in all of this, and we know from day one of the job, he pleaded with management to build him a bunch of redwoods on defense, the way Vegas had won the Stanley Cup the year before. And sure enough, the Canucks went out and they signed Carson Soucy, and then they go and they make the midseason trade for Nikita Zadorov. I don't think that Rick Tocchet has any interest in seeing all of this stripped away this quickly. So they've re-signed Filip Hronek. I think Zadorov is high on their priority list. You saw in the playoffs how they utilized him. That often is the surest tell from a coaching standpoint. What they think of players is how much do they use them in key situations. And Zadorov was out there, including as a net front presence with the goaltender pulled for an extra attacker late in games. And, the offense, obviously, that's part of the issue too, is that you've got Hughes and Hronek as a sort of superpower turbocharged pair. After that, Soucy and Myers have a role to play. They did a nice job with their size and their length and the reach of keeping the Oilers to the perimeter. McDavid was relatively quiet. I mean, of all the four series, his lowest point total was against the Vancouver Canucks, but it came at a cost of Myers and Soucy getting buried on every shift, right? Like, it was treading water, it was holding your breath, it was a roller coaster, and it was all they could do to get the puck and flip it high to center ice and race to the bench for a change. They don't have a lot in the way of puck movers. Zadorov isn't your classic puck mover because the guy's 6'6" and 230 pounds, but we know he loves to skate with the puck. He had the green light in the playoffs, and he had some success there. So, he's multifaceted. I'm also of the opinion, and Tyler Myers and Ian Cole showed that, defensemen can age a little more gracefully, I think, in the NHL than forwards. And so I have no issues if the Canucks were to go 5 or 6 years on term with Zadorov. I think it all comes down to money that they haven't had enough of, obviously, to get Zadorov to commit to this point. But now the equation has changed. But I'm with you. I think he has always been higher on their priority list. And the fact that, he hasn't made any public declaration about wanting to hit the free agent market, like, I think his heart is here. He's sold on the city. He's sold on this group, the coaching staff. And so I'm not going to be surprised if the Canucks get something done before the free agent window opens. I think I would be surprised if he made it to free agency at this stage. Beyond that, all of the breadcrumbs are pointing to the Canucks taking a big swing at Jake Gensel. And there's an association there with the management group. We know that. There's a need for a top-level scorer, an elite finisher. There's room on the power play for a guy to step right in and be a difference maker. And so, I expect the Canucks to make their play. But the problem with free agency is there's going to be a bunch of suitors for Jake Gensel. And he's going to get paid wherever he goes. I mean, he is sitting in the catbird seat without a doubt. And I read LeBrun's piece today at The Athletic that, Carolina still hasn't given up hope of, even though the word was out there that they were putting his rights on the market. Obviously, he hasn't moved his rights to this point, so he still remains Carolina property. And it sounded like Eric Tulsky was holding out hope that maybe somehow, some way that Carolina could get something done there with Jake Gensel. So the Canucks have to be ready to be nimble. They've got to have a plan B and a plan C. And I mean, those names are out there as well, whether it's Tyler Toffoli or, Jake DeBrusk, who knows who plan B and plan C in what order. But if you're the Canucks, you got to be ready. If Gensel pounces, or if Gensel decides to take his time and sit back and see what's going on there. That's the other thing too, that, when there is one identified top level scoring winger, Gensel doesn't have to jump into anything. He can sit there, and then it's a case of how patient are you willing to be as other players come off the board on Monday, and that's what makes those first few hours of free agency just so fascinating. And this year it's going to be fun. Hey, the Canucks aren't going to be fun around the draft, I don't think, but Monday morning should be some fun because the Canucks are going to be front and center.
We'll have tons of content here at Canucks Army. Jeff writes for Canucks Army as well. We have a lot of new people. I'm sure some people are looking at us for the first time and saying, who are these guys? CanucksArmy.com is your one-stop shop for everything Canucks. And of course, we're live to you right now on YouTube. We will have a live show on July 1st. It'll be me, just me, but I'll have a cycle of people. And maybe, I know, Jeff, you'll be very busy that day, but maybe you'll have time to stop by and chat with me for 5 minutes about who the Canucks signed. And hey, who knows? Maybe it'll be Jake Gensel, but we're here breaking down the Ilya Mikheyev trade to the Chicago. Wow, that was really an accent there, to the Chicago Blackhawks. And if you're just joining us, it's Ilya Mikheyev, a 2027 second-round pick, along with Sam Lafferty, pending UFA, and the Canucks getting back a fourth-round pick in the 2027 draft. Canucks retaining 15% on Ilya Mikheyev.
Should we be giving Sam Lafferty any love here? Like, were the Blackhawks, did they insist that he was an add-on so that they could have him back again? Because obviously they traded him to Toronto for the playoff run. Or was this he's going to be an unrestricted free agent. And quite frankly, the way that he played down the stretch and into the playoffs and was a healthy scratch, I can't imagine that there's going to be this massive bidding war for Sam Lafferty's services. In fact, when I wrote my year-end piece at Canucks Army about Sam Lafferty, I kind of felt like he'll get next year in the National Hockey League, but I don't know that there's anything beyond that guaranteed. That, he's pushing 30, and for the things that he does, there are, younger, cheaper alternatives out there. He's an intriguing combination of size and speed that just never really lived up to, I don't want to say expectation, but just didn't apply the skill set that he had at the NHL level as fully as he ought to have.
I said this to Harmon today on Canucks Convo, Jeff. I said, whichever team signs Sam Lafferty, the press release is going to say he can play center, he can play wing, he's versatile, he can kill penalties. They're going to talk about all of that in the press release. Clearly, there's a market for Sam Lafferty. I wrote a piece at Canucks Army last week, and I need to tell you this about predicting each Canucks free agent's next team and next contract. I predicted Bluger would re-sign with the Canucks. I had him at 2x2, signs today for 2 years at $1.8 million. We can touch on that at the end here. But I had Sam Lafferty at 2 years, $1.5 million, and I was going through teams, and I kid you not, I only picked one, but in my list when I was preparing the article, I had the Calgary Flames, I ended up putting down as the team, and the Chicago Blackhawks. But I thought it's too cheap to write about, oh yeah, they're going to want a reunion. But clearly they do. Clearly the Chicago Blackhawks wanted Sam Lafferty back because they trade for his UFA rights. And hey, maybe he'll pull a Dan Hamhuis with the Philadelphia Flyers and not actually sign with them. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But
they need players, and they need to round out their cap. So again, he's got size and speed, but just left you wanting most nights. And, for this idea that he was going to be a penalty killer, ended up losing his role there. And in fact, it was funny because when I wrote that year-end piece and just looking at the number, Sam Lafferty actually saw more time on the power play as a Vancouver Canuck than he did killing penalties. And I don't remember him being on the power play. So,
well, how are they going to replace that power play? How are they going to replace those power play minutes? That's our next topic.
The deep dive.
Yeah, the deep dive that nobody asked for. Over 600 people watching us right now on YouTube. We really appreciate it, folks. Hit like and subscribe to the channel. We'll close it out. We talked about the Bluger extension on Canucks Convo today, but you didn't get a chance to chat about it, Jeff. So I'll just ask you your thoughts on the Canucks signing Teddy Bluger to a 2-year deal at $1.8 million, $100,000 less on the AAV there than what they signed him to last summer.
Yeah, I think it's a win for the organization to get a guy that is universally liked and respected. I tweeted out, he is about as low maintenance professional as you will find. Like, this guy just shows up, competes hard, doesn't cause there's no drama around Teddy Bluger. Likable guy, fun to deal with, good to deal with. He's an articulate, intelligent fella as well, who, a ton of versatility. And I came to appreciate that. When they signed him, I thought, okay, the reunion, another Pittsburgh guy who coming off being around the cup, didn't play a lot in Vegas, but championship pedigree. But when you think of a guy that started the season on IR, suffered a foot injury in the final preseason game against Calgary and missed the first 6 weeks of the season, that's not easy to jump back into the National Hockey League when everybody else has a 6-week head start. And he came back as Pius Suter left, got that opportunity to play with Garland and Joshua, and became the best third line in hockey for a while. And, he was a part of that. He wasn't a passenger without a doubt. And he met the media via Zoom earlier today. I asked him a little bit about, hey, did we see the best of Teddy Bluger over the course of the season? Were there areas you'd still like to improve? And he said he thought for a couple of months there, that was the most consistent he had played in the National Hockey League. He recognized that the scoring disappeared on him down the stretch and into the playoffs, so he thinks that maybe there's a little more to give there. But yeah, I mean, he could have shopped himself, and I think could have probably got paid a little bit more. But there's something to be said about finding a comfortable spot where you're wanted, where you're utilized, face-offs, penalty kill. He was the leading penalty killing ice time guy among the forwards for the Canucks. And in the playoffs, only Ian Cole spent more time shorthanded on the ice than Teddy Bluger. So, a lot of their pending UFAs were penalty killers. I think this was an important signing to get one of their best in that area locked down and back, and not just for another year, but for 2 years. And I asked him also, did he have any appetite to test the waters? He did it last year, and he said, you know what, it's nerve-wracking. Maybe there's some excitement, but there's also something to be said for the security of a 2-year deal. So to take a little bit of a haircut to get that second year at this stage of his career, to commit to the Vancouver Canucks, I think it's a good move for the hockey club. And, truth be told, my mean editor at CanucksArmy jumped on me to quickly write something and make sure that I hammered away on the fact that, look, on the free agent market, if they were trying to replace Teddy Bluger, they probably would have had to pay. That, the other guys that are sort of in that, late 20s, don't expect a ton of offense. Kevin Stenlund coming off a Stanley Cup in Florida. Sam Carrick got to the final with the Edmonton Oilers. Those guys produced half the number of points that Teddy Bluger did. And it's not about points for a fourth line guy, but you're 28 points. Nothing to sneeze at. A lot of those came when he was playing with Garland and Joshua. But, I think this long list of pending UFAs that the Canucks had, a little surprised when I woke up this morning and the list was as long as it was, as close as it is to free agency. So to check this box and then make the Mikheyev deal, things starting to percolate for the Vancouver Canucks, and that's exciting for us in this business, and I think it's fun and exciting for the fan base as well, waiting to see what comes next.
Okay, let's take a few listener questions before we log off for the night here, Jeff. This one from CS Moon. Any chance of one more big splash on D? I don't know if you'd call it a big splash, but Brendan Dillon's been a guy that we've talked about a lot, it feels like. And, obviously he's a local guy. He's kind of hinted at his desire to come back. And he was always kind of viewed as this plan B if you lose Nikita Zadorov. Very similar on-ice results, but he's going to cost you a fraction of the cost. Obviously, he's older than Nikita Zadorov as well, so it's not going to be a long-term deal or anything like that. But I almost wonder if you can go get Brendan Dillon as well, if you get Zadorov. Obviously, if you don't get Zadorov, you want to go get him kind of as a plan B. But just to add to that depth, right? We know Ian Cole's not coming back. They still have some spots to fill on B, still fill on D. So again, I wouldn't call it a big splash, but I do wonder about Brendan Dillon with this newfound cap space.
Yeah, I think it'd be difficult to get both Zadorov and Dillon and to have places for them to play. You've got Quinn Hughes and you've got Carson Soucy already on the left side. They're both left side defensemen. Neither one of them at this stage of their career sees themselves as, a 6'7" kind of guy. At some point, Dillon's probably going to have to take a step back and recognize that, as the league gets faster, maybe he is going to find himself as a 6'7", and maybe not even an every night guy, but he is at this stage. And so,
yeah,
I just don't know that there's enough room in that sense. Plus, cap considerations. I think they want to have Noah Juleson get every opportunity to be the third pair guy on the right side. Re-sign Mark Friedman. Cole McWard is a name that Patrick Allvin mentioned the day that they signed Hronek. And then the next day they were able to go out or a couple days later, get McWard locked up as a depth signing. But he's 23, just turned 23, a right side defenseman. I think there is a player there in Cole McWard who's already touched NHL ice a couple of times. And so I think the Canucks have to, find that balance and strike that balance of rounding out the roster with 5 solid NHL defensemen, and then try to find some cap savings with whether it's Juleson, whether it's a guy like McWard, and then we know that the focus has to be up front. So I just can't see them committing the dollars that they have to 2 names like that, and I just don't know that the opportunities exist to have 2 of those guys on the blue line together when you already have Hughes and Susie on that left side depth chart.
Yeah, I know everybody's always tried to put Zadorov on the right side. It hasn't really been a fit, so maybe you have to teach Zadorov to shoot the other way. But again, like when we look at the Canucks defense, I always just kind of go back to how they were deployed in the playoff and how there was no real second, third pairing. It was the Hughes-Hronek pairing getting, let's be honest, pretty soft matchups. Like they weren't being put up against the opposition's best. And then was those other 2 pairings going up against that opposition's best. So I don't know. It's a thought I had today that I really like Brendan Dillon. I like Nikita Zadorov as well. So I'm trying to imagine a world.
No, and I know that the name's been kicked around, and I saw him on Donnie and Dolly as well, talking about how much fun it would be to play in his hometown. And, this is probably the last contract in the NHL. I can't say that officially, but he's going to be 34. So he is getting towards the end of his career here. But I like the idea of Brendan Dillon if Zadorov absolutely had closed the door and moved on somewhere else. But since that hasn't happened, I think Zadorov is the focus for the Vancouver Canucks. Maybe Dillon is that next option if things go sideways with Zadorov here between now and Monday morning.
Lots of feedback in the chat. People are wondering if you sleep on that bed. I'm going to guess no.
This is the spare room, so no. Normally I'm in my little rink-wide office with the backdrop, but the house is full. There's kids running around, and I had to take refuge in the spare room here to set up. So whatever it takes to join Canucks Convo.
Looks like a very nice spare room. Okay, we'll close it on this one. This was just a culmination of comments about Dakota Joshua. The thing that I want to stress, because I'm seeing people now say now they have the money to overpay for Dakota Joshua. The thing that I'd stress is that I think the Canucks have to stand by their walkaway number with Dakota Joshua. I don't think you want to be paying Dakota Joshua $4 million over 3 years or for 3 years, right? Like I don't think you want to do a deal like that. I still think the sweet spot for Joshua is probably going to be like a 3x3 if you're the Canucks. Again, even that, like if someone in the chat right now said no, 3x3 is too much, I'd listen. Like I'd still listen. I think he's going to get more than that on the open market, though. I just wonder with Dakota Joshua, what the final contract ends up looking like, and I just don't think that clearing out Ilya Mikheyev is, okay, now let's go overpay for Dakota Joshua.
I think there's a team that'll go 4 years with Dakota Joshua. And quite frankly, this is a guy that hasn't been cashing massive NHL checks since he was 20 or 21. He was a late bloomer, and he has come into his own here under Rick Tocchet. I think he really enjoyed his time in Vancouver, but I will not begrudge him one bit chasing the money here. You don't get many opportunities. He's had to wait to become the player that has become this attractive option for teams. I don't know what the price point ultimately going to be, but if he can get the security of 4 years and the money's right, and look, he's an intriguing package. Obviously, at the size that he is, would have been a 20-goal scorer if he hadn't broken his hand and missed a quarter of the season. He's one of the best Canuck penalty killers, and he'll do that wherever he goes as well. And so, I think he's going to have lots of options, and I think the Canucks have made a pitch. You know what you've got here, Dakota. If you want to be here, this is as far as we're willing to go. But I think the Canucks have to recognize that opportunity is striking for this guy at the right time, and I think he will test the market. It's crazy how quiet it's been around Dakota Joshua. For all the talk about Zadorov daily in this market, Dakota Joshua, we end up talking about him, but there just hasn't been an awful lot of sort of any indication from him or his agent about the cards that they're about to play here over the next 4 or 5 days. So going to be fascinating to see how that one plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see how it all plays out. July 1st, that's the big day, and we'll have a lot of coverage over at CanucksArmy.com. We'll have a live blog, and of course, we'll have some shows for you as well here on Canucks Army and on Rink-Wide Vancouver and on Sakaris and Price. So make sure you go subscribe to all those channels, all those podcasts, all the Canucks content you could possibly need. But we'll close it out there. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me. everybody who watched. We've got a lot of people on YouTube. We've got a lot of people on Twitter. We've got a lot of people on Facebook as well. We appreciate each and every one of you. Yeah, even you, Jonathan, there in the chat on YouTube. We appreciate it, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning into Canucks Conversation. My name is Diego Petrelli. That is Jeff Patterson signing off for now. We'll see you on Saturday. Canucks Conversation is live Monday through Friday, every weekday at 2 p.m. over on the Canucks Army YouTube channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, and interact in the YouTube live chat every day with us, folks.